tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Conservative leader Erin O'Toole has come out with a carbon tax that rivals that of Justin Trudeau. He says it's not a tax, but that's also what the Liberals said about theirs. It is the Conservative Party of Canada's 15-page climate change platform, which, and I'm going to try to explain this, but I was reading it and thought it sounded ridiculous. When I tried saying it out loud to a friend yesterday, it sounded more ridiculous. The premise of it is that every time you buy something like fuel or maybe natural gas, every time you buy hydrocarbon-based fuel, money that you are putting towards the carbon tax, basically, instead goes towards a personal carbon savings account, which you can draw from. It's not the government's money necessarily. You can draw from it, but only when you want to buy green things. So if you want to go and use the money in your personal low carbon savings account to buy gas, you can't do that, but you can buy a bus pass, you can buy an electric car, you can buy a bicycle, you can buy something to retrofit your home and make it more green. So it's basically the government taking your money, putting it into an account that it says is yours, but not one that you are allowed to use as though it's your money. And I want to break this down with Aaron Wudrick, who is the federal director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and joins me now. Aaron, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew.
You and I spoke a couple of weeks back, I think it was, when the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the Trudeau carbon tax was in fact constitutional. And I think the prevailing sentiment of our discussion and other areas in which I discussed this on the show was that now it is a political issue. So you need a strong opposition from a political party. And the only party that's been saying no to the carbon tax is the Conservative Party under Erin O'Toole. Does this plan that Erin O'Toole put forward yesterday consequently, in your mind, mean an end to the carbon tax?
No, not at all. I mean, if anything, it's he's essentially saying he has now taken the side of every other party in supporting a carbon tax. I mean, this is a man that explicitly promised that he would not have a carbon tax. They're playing the same kind of word games that the Liberals are, saying, well, it's not a tax, it's a levy. Look, you can call it whatever you want. If you are taking money from people by force of government, so they can't spend it on what they want to spend it on, that's a tax. So they can give it whatever name they want and use euphemisms just like the Trudeau Liberals. But the reality is they flip-flopped on this. They have now switched sides. And, they've got some explaining to do, given they have for years railed against exactly the sort of thing they're now proposing.
The tax definition is interesting, and this actually came up with the Trudeau carbon tax, because in that case, the Trudeau government said in court and said in the media that it wasn't a tax, and the Conservatives said it was. The Conservatives at the time said, we don't buy that, verbal gymnastics that you're doing here. If you're taking money from people, it's a tax. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
Well, people are getting really caught up in these semantics. But again, the point I always make is, a lot of people try and focus on what the money is used for in sort of determining whether or not it's a tax. I don't view it that way. I think a lot of people, the relevant point for most people is that was money I had that I could spend on whatever I wanted, and now I don't have it. So it doesn't matter if I'm getting it, back in O'Toole bucks, or if I'm getting, services, or if I'm getting something else. I don't have that money to do what I wanted with. So that's the relevant point. I think it's too cute. It was cute when the Liberals did it, and now it's the same with the Conservatives. I think most people roll their eyes at the idea that you can just not label it a tax and somehow it will not function as a tax on people.
I should, put so many asterisks in front of this to establish that I'm not defending the Liberals. But one thing I will say is that with the Trudeau carbon tax, the climate action incentive rebate that they gave, which I summarily mocked when it was introduced because you're trying to bribe people with their own money. But at least when I cashed my climate action incentive check, I could spend it on whatever I wanted. O'Toole bucks are not fungible in the same way.
Well, that's frankly the danger that I think Mr. O'Toole has raised here, is that he suddenly, for some people, made the Trudeau rebates look nice by comparison, right? If they were struggling to come up with a way to compete with Mr. Trudeau and they basically landed on coupons or loyalty points instead of cash, I mean, look, people like loyalty points, but they rather have cash given the choice. And again, I know that Mr. O'Toole says, well, Mr. Trudeau may keep that money. Well, guess what? You just broke a promise too. So how do we know that you might not change your mind on things later on as well?
I want to go back to, and you mentioned that he made a promise. He didn't just say it in interviews with me, but I know actually signed a pledge with your organization, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and I want to put that photo up on the screen for people to see. I know you can't make out the text of it, but basically, what was that pledge?
Yeah, the pledge was to scrap the Trudeau carbon tax and to not introduce a similar carbon tax or a cap and trade system. So, this is pretty explicit that he has reversed himself on that. He's broken that pledge. And look, I think that's something that he's going to have to answer for with the people who supported him and support him now.
I know the loyalty program is the, if you can even call it that, is the main impetus behind this plan. But there were some other things buried in there that I thought were equally concerning. One that jumped out at me, and partially for personal reasons, because, covering the election campaign had me flying all over the country in 2019, back when that was allowed. It says, studying the potential for introducing new taxes on frequent flyers, non-electric luxury vehicles, and second homes to deter activities that hurt the environment. Now, obviously, this is kind of a wink-wink in a way to the left, because these are activities that are associated with wealth and elite status and all of these things. But at the same time, this is a very ostentatious usage of the word tax. So they're quite open about the fact that if you have a second home, which sounds like something that is a privilege for the 1%, but there are a lot of middle-class families that have family cottages, or people that may have a condo that they rent out and are not by any means wealthy. They may be facing new taxes.
Yeah, well, and that's our concern as an organization that fights for lower taxation, is that they've opened the door wide open to all kinds of potential new taxes and new increases for people. Look, we never got into these debates because we're against fighting climate change. What we're against is crippling people and businesses and families with higher costs, with newer taxes. So we're not fussy, if the end result of a new measure is that it hammers families or businesses with higher costs, then we're against it, because we think that's damaging. And frankly, especially in the case of these carbon taxes, we're not seeing the upside. I mean, everybody points to British Columbia as the sort of golden example. Well, they've had a carbon tax there for years, and emissions have not gone down.
One thing as well that was a problem with the national carbon tax, in addition to the tax part, was the national part. And this was something that was rammed down the throats of provinces, which was really the thrust behind the challenges in court, one of which ended up being found unconstitutional in Alberta. But I have to ask about this, because I've read through this and there are numerous references to working with provinces, but it still is a national program. And I think in a lot of ways even more national than the Trudeau approach, the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, because that act says if a province meets this emissions reduction standard, the federal one doesn't kick in. Whereas all that I'm seeing here is that provinces can apply, basically, to have their programs recognized as equivalent. And I don't know if you've had any conversations or have looked into this and found any areas where provinces do have explicit autonomy within this plan?
No, I mean, I do recall Mr. O'Toole saying, that it's going to be a partnership, and then it's, they're going to work with the provinces. So it sounds like they want to be flexible on it. But, that's the same thing that Mr. Trudeau said, and he put in a backstop. So if he's going to simply replace one backstop, the rebate backstop, with the loyalty points backstop, I mean, it's essentially the same. It is still Ottawa dictating terms to the provinces.
Aaron Wudrick, Federal Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Not the greatest day for people like you and I who have been advocating against the carbon tax for some time, you especially, but I appreciate you joining me nonetheless.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.